Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I was 21 when I decided to leave everything behind. Growing up in a small town just outside a major city, I'd spent my whole life surrounded by the constant hum of activity. It was never quiet. The city was loud, always cars honking, people talking, sirens in the distance, the buzzing of neon signs in the middle of the night. I thought I'd grown used to it, but after college, I realized just how exhausted I was by it all. I needed a change. I needed to escape. I was young, naive, and brimming with that misguided sense of independence that only youth can bring. I packed my things and drove to Texas, hoping for a fresh start. I had no job lined up, no friends or family waiting for me, just the open road and a vague notion of finding something new. I didn't expect to find anything too exciting, just a place to live, something simple. The rent had to be cheap and the area had to be quiet. I found an ad online for a guest house to rent, located behind a larger house on a quiet suburban street. It sounded perfect. The price was low too, especially for Texas, where things tended to be more affordable than where I came from. So without hesitation, I reached out to the landlord. The landlord, Mr. Holloway, was an older man. He had silver hair and a face that looked like it had weathered years of both hard work and perhaps a few regrets. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if he was considering every word before it left his mouth. He wasn't rude, but there was something about him that made you feel like you were being evaluated the entire time you were in his presence. I remember the first time I met him. I drove to the house to meet him in person and take a look at the guest house. As I pulled up, I noticed how isolated it felt, tucked away at the end of a quiet street, with only a few other houses around. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, I thought at the time. The kind of quiet that's almost unnatural. The type where you can hear the wind moving through the trees and the sound of your own footsteps on the dirt. Mr. Holloway greeted me at the door, his face giving off a warm but distant smile. He was tall, thin, and wore a well-worn sweater with patches on the elbows. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor, and his eyes were a pale blue that seemed to flicker, like they were never quite focused. When he spoke, it was with a soft southern drawl, slow and deliberate, but there was a certain stiffness to him that made me feel like he wasn't quite at ease. After a brief introduction, we started the tour of the guest house. It wasn't much to look at, but it was clean and well maintained. A small, single-story building with a couple of rooms, a little kitchen, and a small living area. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the floors were hardwood, creaking slightly when you walked across them. The furniture was basic: a bed with a quilt, an old armchair by the window, and a small table in the corner. When we entered the bedroom, I noticed the window looked out onto the backyard. Beyond the fence, there were trees that stretched high into the sky, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could see a patch of land behind the house where Holloway had a small garden. The whole place had a quiet, almost serene quality to it. I asked Holloway about the area, about the neighbors, just making small talk. He gave me vague answers, nodding politely, but never offering too much. As we moved through the rooms, he finally paused by the door leading to the guest house's small porch. He turned to me then, his expression tightening slightly, and said in a low voice, "There's one rule I need to make clear. Always lock your doors at night, and I mean always." I looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his tone. I nodded, not wanting to seem like I was questioning him. "Of course," I said, trying to mask the discomfort I was feeling. "Why is that? Just a precaution?" His lips pressed into a thin line as he studied me for a moment, his eyes unreadable. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he gave a slight nod. Just to be safe. That's all he said. I didn't push him further, thinking it was just some odd quirk of his. Maybe he'd had bad experiences with past tenants or had been a victim of some crime before. It wasn't unusual for people to be overly cautious, especially in an unfamiliar area. The rest of the tour was uneventful. Holloway showed me around the garden and the main house, which was large and almost imposing. The main house, I learned, was where he lived alone. He mentioned briefly that his wife had passed away a few years ago. I signed the lease that afternoon and I'm eager to get settled in and start my new life. That first night in the guest house, I spent hours unpacking my things, trying to make the space feel like home. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I felt a strange sense of relief as I set my things down. I placed a few personal items around the house, a picture of my family, a small lamp with a soft light, and set up my bed with fresh sheets. The air outside was warm and thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin in Texas. I could hear crickets chirping in the distance and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the trees outside. There was something soothing about it, something that made the quiet feel comfortable instead of lonely. I thought I'd sleep well that night, but I didn't. That night, the silence was oppressive. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness. I could hear my heartbeat in the quiet. There was no traffic, no distant hum of a city to drown out my thoughts. The darkness in the room was heavy, as if it had weight. It wasn't long before I started to hear strange noises. At first, it was nothing, just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional creak of the house settling. But then, I started to hear something else. A faint rustling, a shuffle. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving outside. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. There were plenty of raccoons, possums, and coyotes around. The rustling could have been any one of them. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was had moved from the yard to right outside my window. It was unnerving, but I kept telling myself that I was just being paranoid. It wasn't like anyone was out there, right? Still, I couldn't stop myself from getting up and quietly pulling back the curtain. I wanted to see if there was something, anything out there. The moonlight was soft, casting long shadows across the yard. But there was nothing. No animal, no person, just the empty space and the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went back to bed, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had crept into my chest, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. The quiet outside, the emptiness, it all felt wrong. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening to the rustling sounds outside, still unsure of what was causing them. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the wind, just the Texas wildlife. But deep down, I knew there was something else. Finally, exhaustion won over, and I drifted off to sleep. But even then, the unease stayed with me. The next morning, the sun came up, and the world outside was bright and cheery again. The strange feeling seemed to dissipate with the daylight, but something inside me still felt unsettled. I tried to shake it off. It was just nerves, I told myself. A new place, a new environment. It was bound to make me feel uneasy. But every night after that, the feeling came back. It was only a matter of time before that feeling became something more. The days blended together. The isolation of the guest house, though initially appealing, began to feel stifling. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was almost suffocating. The rustling outside, which had once seemed harmless, had become a regular part of my nights. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I could feel it creeping in, the sensation that I wasn't truly alone. I tried to convince myself it was just the sounds of nature. Texas was full of wild animals, and they came out in the dead of night. But there was something about the way the noises lingered, persistent and deliberate, that made me doubt myself. I made a habit of checking the locks every night before bed, but it always felt like a half-hearted attempt to reassure myself. Mr. Holloway's warning echoed in my mind, especially his cryptic tone as he'd said, "Always lock your doors at night." His words seemed to hang in the air, weighing me down. It wasn't just the sounds anymore, it was the strange feeling of being watched. There were nights when I would lie still in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I could almost feel someone's eyes on me. It was the kind of feeling that made your skin crawl, like a shadow was just behind you, waiting to pounce. I told myself it was nothing more than anxiety. Maybe it was the stress of being in an unfamiliar place. But even as I tried to dismiss the thought, it clung to me like a persistent ghost. One particular night, after a long day of trying to get settled in, I decided to take a walk. The sun had just set and the air was cooler, with that crisp Texas evening breeze. I thought maybe a little exercise would clear my mind and help me sleep. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The quiet was overwhelming. The only sounds were the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rustling of the trees. The path around the guest house was simple, just a dirt trail that wound around the side of the house and into the backyard. I walked along it, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me since I'd moved in. I passed by the trees, their thick trunks twisting up toward the sky, branches reaching out like fingers. The moon was high and full, casting its pale light across everything, making the shadows long and exaggerated. I stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. But then I heard it again, the soft shuffling sound. It was faint, but it was there, just beyond the trees. I froze. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't the usual sounds of nocturnal animals moving around. It was something else. The sound wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate. Someone or something was moving with purpose. My heart began to race as I strained my ears, listening harder. The rustling grew louder, closer. I turned quickly and hurried back toward the guest house. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every step I took felt too loud, like someone could hear me coming. I made it back to the porch and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking and my mind raced with questions. Who was out there? Why did it feel like I was being watched? Was someone lurking around my house in the middle of the night? I checked the locks again, even though I knew they were secure. I couldn't explain the feeling that something was wrong. I had to dismiss it, though. There was no logical reason for it, right? But still, I couldn't shake the dread that had settled into my chest. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The usual creaks and groans of the house kept me awake, and the rustling outside didn't stop. I could hear it faintly through the walls, something moving in the yard. The wind? A stray animal? Or was it something more? I lay in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs, and listened. The minutes stretched on like hours. Then I heard it. The soft click of a door unlocking. I sat up, my heart leaping into my throat. I listened, waiting, but the house was still. My mind raced. Could I have imagined it? Maybe it was just the house settling? No. This was different. I swung my legs out of bed, my feet landing on the cold hardwood floor. I stood in the darkness, straining to hear. The clicking sound came again. It was unmistakable. The front door, the one that I had locked tight just hours before, was being opened. I felt my blood run cold. I didn't move. I just stood there, listening to the slow, deliberate sound of the door creaking open. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The door opened further. Then the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps, entered the house. I froze, unable to move, my body locked in a state of terror. The footsteps came closer. Slow, measured steps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could see the shadow now, just a vague shape blocking the dim moonlight that filtered through the window. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, like it didn't quite know how to walk properly. And then I heard a voice. It was low, guttural, almost like a whisper. The words didn't make sense. It was too soft, too muffled. I couldn't tell if it was even a language or just the someone half lost in their own head. Then our eyes met. Without warning, the figure lunged. Everything happened at once. My mind didn't register what was happening until I was already on the floor, fighting for my life. The man, if it was a man, was on top of me, his hands gripping my arms, his body pressing down on mine. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, trying to break free. I managed to land a punch to his jaw, but it didn't seem to faze him. He was relentless, his breath ragged, as if he was hungry for something. I was trapped, unable to get away. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. I fought harder, clawing at him, trying to push him off me. Furniture tipped over as we moved, the small lamp on the table falling to the floor and shattering with a loud crash. I didn't care. I just needed to get free. Somehow, through sheer panic and desperation, I managed to break his grip. I kicked hard, pushing him off me, and scrambled to my feet. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran for the door, stumbling as I made my way across the room, desperate to escape. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I thought I would go deaf. I reached the door and slammed it open, running across the yard toward the main house. My breath was ragged, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I pounded on the door, my fists hitting it with all the strength I had left. "Let me in! Please let me in!" I screamed, my voice raw, panicked. The door opened slowly, and there was Mr. Holloway, his face a mask of calm that made my stomach twist. He didn't ask what was wrong, he didn't say anything at all. He simply stepped aside and let me in, locking the door behind me. As the sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the silence, he sighed. "I was afraid of this," he said softly. His words sent a chill down my spine. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that rattled my nerves. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I stood there, trembling in the dim hallway of Mr. Holloway's house, not knowing what to do. Holloway, as calm as ever, locked the door behind me with a methodical click. The calmness of his actions only seemed to deepen the pit of dread in my stomach. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there for a moment, his face unreadable. I was too terrified, too shaken to say anything either. My mind was still trying to process what had happened. The shadowy figure, the struggle, the terror that still gripped me. It all felt surreal, like some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. After a long pause, Holloway finally spoke, his voice low and grave. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to ask him who the hell that man was. Why did he do that? Why didn't he warn me about any of this? Why was he so calm about the whole thing? Instead, I just stood there, shaking uncontrollably, not knowing how to even form a sentence. "I'm calling the police," Holloway continued, his tone still even, but now with a sense of urgency behind it. "Don't worry. They'll handle this." He walked over to the phone in the living room and dialed the number, his movements deliberate. I stood there, frozen, my mind running over the same questions. Who was that man? How did he get in? Holloway's eyes never left the phone as he spoke to the dispatcher, telling them what had happened, though as he spoke, he sounded strangely detached, as if this was all a routine. He explained that I was in the guest house, that I'd been attacked, that the intruder had been contained. It all sounded too calm, too practiced. Something about it sent another wave of unease through me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he hung up the phone. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked like regret or maybe guilt. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice soft but heavy with something I couldn't place. "I was hoping it wouldn't happen again." That's when it hit me, the way he said "again." He had said "again" as if this had happened before. as if I wasn't the first person to experience whatever this was. "What the hell are you talking about?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. My legs were weak, and I felt like I might collapse right there. But I needed answers. I couldn't just stand there in confusion anymore. Holloway hesitated, then seemed to sigh, as though the weight of the situation was finally sinking in for him. He ran a hand through his hair, looking at me with a deep sadness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He slowly walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back, peering out into the darkened yard as if searching for something, or perhaps waiting for someone. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "That man, Jonah, is my nephew. He's been unwell for a long time. He was in a mental institution for a while, but he's been out for years. I've been trying to help him, but it hasn't been easy." I was confused. "Help him? He just attacked me." Holloway's shoulders slumped. I know. He's unstable. He's been that way for as long as I can remember. He's hurt other tenants in the past, and I've had to take care of things quietly. But I was hoping it wouldn't happen again. I thought he was doing better. I thought maybe, just maybe, he had finally found some peace. Found peace? My voice shook with disbelief. He attacked me. He came into my house in the middle of the night. I thought I was going to die. Holloway turned to face me fully, his expression a mixture of sorrow and guilt. "I should have warned you. I should have told you everything from the start. But I didn't want you to be afraid. I didn't want you to leave. You seemed like you needed a fresh start, and I didn't want to ruin that." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding my breath. The landlord had known. He had known all along that his nephew had a history of violence, that he had a history of attacking previous tenants, and yet he hadn't said a word to me. He hadn't warned me. He'd let me walk into this situation blindly, and now I was paying the price for his silence. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. "You knew he would come for me? You knew this might happen, and you didn't tell me?" Holloway's face twisted with regret. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep him away from the guest house. But I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to get hurt." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to lash out, to shout at him for being so careless, so negligent with my safety. But nothing came out. All I could do was stand there, shaking, feeling the weight of the past few hours crashing down on me. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls as they made their way into the house. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching it all from a distance, unable to truly understand what was happening. Jonah was arrested without incident when they found him trying to slip away from the property through the back gate. He was calm, eerily calm, and when they took him away, he didn't even fight. As the police took Jonah away, I stood in the doorway of the main house watching the scene unfold. My mind was in a fog. It was all too much to process. Holloway, who had seemed so calm and reassuring when I first met him, was now just a figure in the background, talking quietly to the officers, offering them more details about Jonah's history. It seemed as though he had lived his entire life managing his nephew's mental health issues in isolation, never involving the authorities, never telling anyone, and never once warning the people he rented out his guest house to. I couldn't stay there another night. The thought of going back to the guest house, of being in that place again, was unbearable. Holloway offered to let me stay in the main house until I figured things out, but I couldn't. I gathered my things quickly, ignoring the pit in my stomach that told me I'd never be able to escape the memory of that night. I called a friend from back home and asked if I could crash with them for a while. By morning, I was gone. I left Texas the next day, never to return. Holloway's apologies still echo in my mind, but they do little to ease the terror I felt that night. I still think about what happened, and I can't shake the feeling that I was just another tenant in a long line of people who had been caught in the wake of Jonah's violence. Uh, I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't broken free that night, if I hadn't run to the main house and knocked on that door. Would I still be here telling this story, or would I have become another forgotten victim of someone like Jonah? I don't know. But one thing is certain. There are secrets in the quiet places. And sometimes you never know what's hiding just beyond the door. I remember the day I moved in like it was yesterday. It was early spring in Texas, hotter than I expected for the time of year, but I guess that's just how it is down here. I had just finished college and landed a decent job in the area, so I figured it was time to start fresh. No more sharing tiny apartments or living with roommates. I was going to be independent. I found this house in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of town. It was a little older than I thought I wanted, but it had character. Big front porch, mature trees in the yard, and a nice little garden that just needed some work. It was cozy in a way that felt like a place where I could actually build a life. The only thing that struck me as odd was how cheap it was. The previous owner, an older woman named Mrs. Harvey, had sold it at a price way lower than comparable homes in the area. The realtor didn't offer much explanation, just said that Mrs. Harvey was downsizing and moving to a retirement home. To be honest, I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just relieved I could afford a place that felt like a real home. So after signing the paperwork, I moved in. I spent my first night unpacking boxes in the living room. It felt a little strange at first, being in a new place. The house was old, and the floorboards creaked in ways that made it feel like it had a life of its own. But nothing really scary happened. The house was just old. I kept telling myself that. It wasn't until later that night that things started to get weird. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when I decided to call my best friends, Mia and Jordan. I hadn't seen them in a while since they both lived a couple of hours away, so I figured it would be good to catch up. I dialed the video call, and after a few rings, they both picked up. "Hey girl," Mia said, her voice chirpy. "How's the new house?" "It's good," I replied, adjusting the camera on my phone so they could see the unpacked boxes behind me. "Still a mess, but I'm excited. It feels weirdly cozy here. I think I'm going to like it." Jordan, who was sitting beside Mia, grinned. "Yeah, I saw the pictures you sent. It looks like a haunted house." I laughed, shaking my head. "Please, you're not going to make me paranoid, are you?" "I mean, yeah, it's an old house, but it's fine. I'm sure I'll get used to it." Mia leaned in closer to the camera. "Didn't you say the last owner sold it for way less than it was worth? You think it's because it's haunted?" I rolled my eyes. "No, Mia, it's because she wanted to downsize. No ghost stories here, okay?" I said it jokingly, but I couldn't help feeling a little uneasy. The house did have that old, lived-in feel, the kind of house where creaks and moans came with the territory. We all laughed for a few minutes, chatting about everything and nothing at the same time. It felt good to talk to them, and I was starting to feel comfortable in the new place. But then something happened that completely shifted the mood of the conversation. Mia froze. Her expression went pale, her eyes wide and locked onto something behind me. I was still talking when I noticed that she wasn't responding, her mouth slightly open. "Mia?" I asked, confused. She slowly lifted her hand to the screen, pointing at something. "Who's that behind you?" I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to mess with me. "Okay, very funny. Who put you up to this, Jordan?" But Jordan's face wasn't smiling. He had gone completely still, his eyes scanning the background behind me. "No, seriously, Rachel, there's someone standing in your hallway." I froze. The playful mood vanished instantly. I glanced behind me, heart suddenly racing. The hallway was empty. "I don't see anyone," I said, my voice a little shaky now. But even as I spoke, a cold feeling washed over me. I could feel my heartbeat quicken like something was off. I turned back to the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "You guys are messing with me, right?" Mia was shaking her head slowly, her voice trembling. "No, Rachel, there's someone there." I looked again. Still, nothing. But then, I saw it. In the reflection of the TV screen, just barely visible in the dim light, there was a figure standing in the hallway. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by shadows. The color drained from my face. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something had been there. I turned back to my phone, now genuinely scared. "Okay, I'm freaking out a little. I swear I saw someone, but there's no one here." Mia and Jordan were both on edge now. "Rachel, lock the doors," Mia said, her voice urgent. "Just check your windows, okay? It's late. Maybe it was a shadow or something, but just check." I nodded, trying to calm myself down, but my hands were shaking. Okay, I'm just being paranoid. It's fine." But deep down, I felt like something was watching me. Something was in that hallway. I stood up, keeping my eyes on the hall as I moved cautiously toward the front door. I double-checked the locks, making sure they were secure. As I walked back to the living room, my eyes darted around every corner, every shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I laughed nervously, trying to push the fear down. "All right. I locked everything. I'm just being ridiculous, right?" Mia and Jordan didn't seem convinced. "Stay on the phone with us," Jordan said, his voice tight with concern. "We'll stay on until you're sure you're okay." I agreed, and we continued talking, but now I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, my eyes constantly flicking back to the hallway. Something was still nagging at me, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could feel it in my bones. I don't know how long it was before Mia spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, there's someone behind you again." I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. This time there was no mistaking it. The figure was closer, moving slowly toward me, just out of the corner of my eye. And this time, I wasn't imagining it. He was real. I couldn't breathe. Time seemed to slow down as I stared at the figure in the reflection of the TV. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light anymore. I could see him clearly. He was standing in the hallway, only a few feet away from the living room, inching closer. My heart slammed in my chest as panic hit me full force. The sound of my pulse pounding in my ears drowned out everything else. I spun around again, this time for real. I needed to see what was behind me to confirm that my worst fears weren't coming true. But the hallway was still empty. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, my voice shaking as I spoke into the phone. "Mia, Jordan, I can't see him. He's not here. But I could feel him. I could feel him." I turned back to the phone, eyes darting from side to side. My hands were clammy, and I wiped them on my jeans, trying to keep it together. "Okay, I know I'm freaking out, but I swear I saw someone. He's in here, I'm telling you." Mia and Jordan didn't say anything for a moment. They were just staring at the screen, their faces pale and tense. Neither one of them saying what they were both clearly thinking. "You need to get out of there." I nodded, though my whole body was shaking. My eyes were glued to the hallway, my mind racing, trying to figure out if I was just imagining things, if this was all in my head. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. This time, he was moving. Slowly but unmistakably, his head tilting slightly as he crept forward. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, and eerie. I couldn't see his face well, but the outline of his body was now clearer. He was tall, uncomfortably tall, and the way he moved, it was like he wasn't in a hurry, like he was enjoying this. I choked on my breath. My entire body froze, but my mind screamed at me to run, to do anything. I turned back to the phone, barely able to form words. "Oh my God, he's moving. He's coming closer." "Rachel, get out of there. Now," Mia cried, her voice higher than usual, panic rising. "Get out! Call the police!" I was too scared to move, too frozen in place, like I was glued to the floor. My eyes darted between the hallway and the phone screen. I could still hear them on the other end, but everything felt distant, like I was in a dream, trapped in my own fear. And then, before I could react, it happened. I saw the man take a step forward, and that's when my eyes met his, just for a split second. Those eyes, they were empty, dark, hollow, like he was staring into me, seeing things no one should ever see. He had this cold, calculating look that made my stomach churn, and I suddenly realized he wasn't here for a robbery. He wasn't here for anything I understood. He was here for me. I snapped out of my trance and bolted to my feet, knocking the phone off the coffee table. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I sprinted for the kitchen, panic making my legs feel like jelly. My hands fumbled for the light switch, my heart hammering in my chest like it might explode. I had no plan. I didn't know where to hide or what to use to defend myself. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I slammed the kitchen door behind me, locking it and backing away, my mind spinning. There was a window in the kitchen, but it was too high up to climb out of. The only thing I could do was get to my phone, call 911, and pray that the police would get here before he did. But when I reached for the phone, my heart sank. My phone was gone. It must have fallen under the couch. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Just then I heard a soft sound, a shuffling step. He was coming. The door handle rattled and I recoiled instinctively, holding my breath. I could hear him on the other side of the door, breathing quietly, as if savoring the moment. Why wasn't he saying anything? I had no time to think. I scrambled for anything I could use as a weapon. My hands landed on the wine bottle that had been left on the counter, still half full from earlier. Without thinking, I gripped it tightly in my hand, and the glass felt cold against my skin. I backed into the corner of the kitchen, holding the bottle like a shield, praying that whatever was on the other side of the door would go away. But I could hear him moving now, closer. He was too close. Suddenly the door swung open, and he stepped inside. His dark figure loomed in the doorway, like a shadow swallowing up everything around him. I swung the bottle toward him without hesitation, hitting him in the head with a sickening thud. He staggered back for a moment, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He recovered quickly and lunged forward, his hands grabbing my wrist in a vice-like grip. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his fingers dug in like they were made of steel. "Be quiet," he hissed, his voice cold and rough. The sheer terror surged through me, my mind scrambling for a way out. The only thing I could do was fight back. I kicked and punched, anything to get away. My mind raced for an escape. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, I yanked my wrist free from his grasp, and the wine bottle shattered against the kitchen counter. The jagged glass could barely slow him down, but it was enough. I bolted for the front door, my legs pumping as fast as they could go. My hands were shaking so badly that it took all my strength to unlock the deadbolt. I yanked the door open, and just as I stepped out onto the porch, I felt him grab my ankle. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, as he yanked me back inside. My face hit the floor, my head spinning from the impact. My breath came in gasps, my body trembling, but I had no choice. I had to get out. I kicked at him again, trying to break free, but the grip on my ankle tightened. Just as I was about to scream again, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The flashing red and blue lights flooded through the windows, and I heard the police shouting outside. The man's grip loosened for just a moment, and in that second I scrambled toward the door, flinging it open just as a cop car pulled into the driveway. I heard the man curse under his breath, and before I could react, he bolted toward the back door. But the officers were already there, surrounding the house. I saw them tackle him to the ground, their radios blaring, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was over. The police were quick to take control of the situation. As soon as they had the man cuffed and sitting on the hood of their cruiser, they turned to me, trying to piece together what had happened. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand, but I did my best to explain, recounting everything I had seen and heard in the last half hour. The officers were kind, trying to reassure me, but their expressions were grim as they listened to my story. They told me I was incredibly lucky that I had acted fast and that my friends were a gift. They had called the police when they hadn't heard from me. "He's been breaking into homes around here," one of them said, his voice serious. But this was the first time he went after someone inside. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. The idea that this man had been prowling around my neighborhood, lurking in other homes before, made my blood run cold. And yet, despite that, it felt unreal. It was like something straight out of a movie, but it was happening to me. I looked at the man, still restrained by two officers. He was barely conscious, his face bruised from where I'd struck him with the wine bottle. His dark, vacant eyes stared out into the distance, and it seemed like he wasn't even aware of what was happening. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The thought of what he might have done if I hadn't fought back sent a chill down my spine. My hands still trembled and my mind raced, imagining what might have happened if I hadn't locked that kitchen door, if I hadn't grabbed the wine bottle. I didn't want to think about it. They took the man away in the back of a squad car, and I stood there, frozen, watching until he disappeared from sight. My heart was still pounding, my body was still shaking, but it was over. The immediate danger was gone, but I knew it wasn't really over for me. The next few hours were a blur. The police took a statement from me, asking about anything unusual I had noticed before the break-in. I couldn't think of anything specific, but my mind kept returning to the strange feeling I'd had the entire evening, the sensation that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. That feeling had followed me throughout my time in that house, and it had become so familiar that I almost didn't question it at first. The officers assured me that the man would be charged, and that I was safe now. They left eventually, leaving me alone in the house, the silence feeling so much heavier than it had before. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, his dark eyes boring into me as he moved through the house like a shadow. I never spent another night there. I moved in with Mia for a few weeks while I found a new place, one far away from that street, far away from those memories. I've never heard from the man again, and I hope I never do. I've always dreamt of owning my own home. Growing up in a cramped apartment with my mom, the idea of a house, one all to myself, felt like an unreachable goal. But after years of saving and scraping by, at 26, I finally did it. I bought my first house. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a single-story, modest home tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Texas. The kind of place you imagine when you think of peaceful living. Small, cozy, with a little front yard and a backyard that felt private enough to just be my own little sanctuary. I couldn't have been happier. The neighborhood was strange, but in a good way. Most people were friendly, but there was this unspoken understanding that to everyone kind of kept to themselves. Neighbors would wave at me as I came and went, but no one came over for tea. No one invited me to barbecues or anything like that. It was peaceful, though, just what I wanted. For the first few days, I felt completely at ease. I unpacked all my things and settled in, enjoying the calm, the quiet, the freedom of being in my own space. I was on my own now, no one telling me what to do, no more cramped rooms or shared walls. It was my time to breathe. The house was old but solid. The floors creaked in certain spots, but I liked that. It gave the place character. The air had this musty smell, like an old attic, but a little air freshener and a few open windows, and it was good as new. It was peaceful. I remember the first few nights just lying in bed, feeling the silence wrap around me like a blanket. There was something calming about it, until the nights started to feel different. It began around the second week. I don't know when exactly I first noticed it, but I remember the black sedan. I live on a quiet street, not much traffic, and it's not uncommon for people to park on the street, but this car was strange. It started showing up every night, right around 11 p.m., the same time every night. The car would park across the street, its engine off, the headlights dimmed. The car would sit there completely still. No one would get out, no one would get in. It was just there. I tried to shake it off at first. It could have been a neighbor's guest, right? Maybe someone waiting for a ride. But as the days passed, the car became a nightly presence, always in the same spot, always facing my house. The first few times I tried not to think about it, but then it became hard not to. Every time I looked out the window, there it was. I would pull the blinds closed, but I still knew it was there, watching. And the worst part, it felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how hard I tried. One night I decided to get a closer look. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I told myself. Maybe it was nothing. So I threw on a hoodie and walked out to the front yard, trying to seem casual as I made my way to the sidewalk. The car was still there, parked like usual. I stood there for a few moments, wondering if I should just go back inside. But no, I couldn't let it go on anymore. I needed to know what was going on. With a deep breath, I walked across the street and stopped next to the car. I knocked on the window. There was no movement, no sound. I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I bent down and peered through the window, trying to see if anyone was inside. The car was dark, no lights on. The seats were empty. There wasn't even a hint of movement. Maybe it was just abandoned, or maybe whoever was in there was waiting for someone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I knocked again, this time louder, more forceful. "Hey!" I called. "What are you doing here? Why are you parked in front of my house every night?" I caught his glance just a bit. The silence stretched on. It was like the air around me had frozen. Just as I was about to knock again, I heard the engine roar to life. The car jerked forward, tires squealing as it sped off into the night. My heart was pounding. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. I looked up and down the street, but everything was eerily still. I returned to my house, my legs feeling weak beneath me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some creep who was too scared to talk. Or maybe I was just overthinking things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something wasn't right. That night, I locked all the windows and doors, checking every latch. I crawled into bed, but there was this nagging feeling at the back of my mind. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to fall asleep. My eyes kept flicking toward the window, even though I couldn't see anything from my bed. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breath. But as I listened, I could make out the rhythm of it. Slow, deliberate, breathing. It was coming from under my bed. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, like something was pressing down on me, squeezing the breath out of me. I held perfectly still, barely daring to blink. Was I imagining it? Maybe it was just the creaky house settling. But no, the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be anything but breathing. And it was coming from under my bed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly pulled the blanket tighter around me. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was some animal that had snuck in. A raccoon, a cat, anything but what I was afraid it might be. But no, I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't some innocent creature. My mind raced back to the black sedan, the man who had been sitting in the car, staring at my house night after night. The breathing continued, slow and steady. My pulse thudded in my ears as I listened, my heart skipping every time the sound grew louder. It was like whoever or whatever was under my bed was just waiting. Waiting for me to make a move. Waiting for me to fall asleep, maybe. I felt trapped. The room felt smaller somehow, as though the walls were closing in. The only thing I could hear was the breathing, getting louder and deeper with each passing second. My hand instinctively reached for my phone on the nightstand, but I quickly pulled it back. The screen would light up and I'd be exposed. I couldn't risk that. What if whoever was under my bed saw it? What if they heard me move? I lay there paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. The silence between breaths felt longer, more oppressive, like the space was suffocating me. My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for something, anything that could help me feel safer. But the shadows were all around me. The only thing I could see clearly was the silhouette of the door across the room, standing wide open in the darkness. And then the breathing stopped. I blinked, the sudden silence overwhelming in contrast to the sound that had been filling my ears. It was as if the whole world held its breath with me, and I swear I could hear my heart pounding. I stared at the edge of the bed, my eyes wide, watching the darkness, waiting for something, anything to happen. The air felt colder, too cold, like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. I don't know how much time passed, seconds, minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I slowly turned my head, peering over the edge of the bed, but the room was too dark. I couldn't see a thing. Just as I was about to pull back, hoping to stay hidden under my blankets, my worst fear became reality. A hand shot out from underneath the bed. It grabbed my ankle with a grip that was almost too strong to break. The cold, clammy fingers tightened around my skin, sending a surge of terror through my body. I yelped, jerking my leg back, but the hand held on, dragging me closer to the edge of the bed. I kicked out instinctively, my foot connecting with something hard, something that felt like flesh. The hand recoiled, but by then I was already scrambling backward, my heart racing faster than it had ever raced before. I tried to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The figure under the bed shifted, and in a split second, a body shot out from the shadows, lunging toward me. It was him, the man from the car. The same face, the same dark eyes. He was under my bed the whole time. I couldn't believe it. How could he have been there without me knowing? I tried to push him away, but his weight pinned me to the mattress. One hand gripped my throat, pressing down hard, choking off my air, while the other held my wrists to the bed, forcing them against the mattress. I gasped, struggling to breathe, my fingers clawing at his hand around my neck. His breath was hot, rancid against my face as he leaned in closer, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. His words were a low, incoherent murmur, like he was speaking a language I didn't understand. Panic swelled inside me, and I fought with everything I had, twisting beneath him, trying to break free. But he was too strong. The more I struggled, the harder he gripped me. I couldn't breathe. My vision started to blur, my lungs burning, my body going limp under the pressure of his weight. I felt like I was going to pass out. I had to fight. I had to get out of there. With every last ounce of strength I had, I swung my knee up, connecting with his stomach. He grunted, and for just a second, I was able to shift beneath him. That's when I saw the lamp on the nightstand, my only chance. My hands were trembling as I reached up and grabbed it, pulling it down with all my might. I swung the lamp like a weapon, smashing it against the side of his head. The impact made him stumble backward, and I took the chance. I kicked him off of me and scrambled out of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't waste time. I just ran. I bolted for the door, tearing across the room, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. I threw the door open, screaming for help, my voice cracking with panic. Help! Someone, please. My neighbor, a man named Jerry who lived 2 houses down, was already outside, his phone in hand, rushing over to me. He could see the terror on my face, and without a word, he was already dialing 911. He shouted to his wife to stay inside and keep the doors locked, while I stood there, shivering and gasping for breath, too scared to move. The police arrived quickly, but by then it was too late. The man was gone. There was no sign of the car, no trace of him, just the open bedroom window, flapping in the wind like a cruel reminder of what had happened. They searched the area, canvassed the neighborhood, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. They couldn't find him. They never did. The experience left me shattered. I couldn't sleep for days, couldn't shake the image of his face, the sound of his breath. I installed cameras around the house, changed all the locks, and kept every light on every night. But every time I heard a car drive past, I would freeze, my heart stopping for just a moment. I never felt safe again. The man was still out there, somewhere, watching me. I knew it.